Good day to everyone. I hope you are all in good condition while listening to the story I will share. But before anything else, I have a few reminders. This story contains unpleasant scenarios, so if you are eating or have children with you, it might be best to guide them or finish your meal first before listening. You can call me Bogart. I am an engineer currently assigned to a large company here in Cebu. Sometimes, when I have no work, I relax while listening to stories on this platform. Perhaps it's because I feel like something supernatural has taken over me ever since I experienced a certain eerie incident. This happened in the late 1990s in our hometown of Baez, Negros Oriental. Unlike other stories set in remote places, ours was close to the town center, where there were vast sugarcane fields. My brother, whom we will call Kuya Damen, always reminded me not to take the shortcut home if it was already late at night. That shortcut had a huge acacia tree along the path. I asked him why, because it was a convenient route, and after school, I always passed that way. At that time, I was in my second year of college. Kuya Damen told me that an evil entity resided there. I burst into laughter. Since when did my brother start believing in supernatural beings? He was a doctor. At that time, he wasn't working yet, but was already licensed. He chose to take a break after getting his license to make the most of his free time. We were well off, not extremely wealthy, but well provided for. Our parents were professionals. Our mother was a teacher, and our father was both a prosecutor and a private lawyer. We were only two siblings. Despite my skepticism, Kuya Damen insisted that I should just listen to him. One night, as exams were approaching, I noticed my brother leaving his bedroom. It was as if he was sleepwalking. I furrowed my brows as he walked straight to the door, stepped onto the veranda, and lay down on the floor. I followed him and confirmed that he was indeed sleepwalking. When I tried to wake him up, he suddenly grabbed me by the neck and started strangling me. His eyes were wide and piercing as he stared at me. I immediately struggled to break free. His stare was terrifying, as if he was possessed. Then he stood up and started looking around in confusion. I could clearly see how his expression changed. Then he asked, shocked, how he ended up there when he was just in his bedroom moments ago. I told him everything that had happened. He just scratched his head as if nothing had happened and went back to his room. I didn't bother talking to him after that. Aside from losing my focus on studying, I also noticed a strange smell coming from my brother. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it had the scent of something rotting. Our house was a spacious bungalow with a terrace that faced the veranda. The interior had 3 bedrooms, 1 for our parents and 2 for us siblings. The neighborhood back then wasn't as densely packed as it is now, where houses are built close to each other. There was a long pathway leading to the house, with sugarcane fields on both sides, and at the end of the road was a mangrove area. I often took a shortcut through there. One day, while I was home alone, my parents and my brother were nowhere to be found. We had a house helper, so I asked him where my family was. He told me that my brother had been rushed to the hospital because he suddenly fainted. Our house helper, whom we'll call Mang Aying, said he had no idea what caused it. He just saw my brother collapse on the veranda. I was worried and thought about going to the hospital to check on him, but just as I was preparing to leave, they arrived. My brother seemed to be in good condition. According to our mother, Marissa, he just needed rest. The doctors found nothing wrong with him, aside from exhaustion. I was confused, exhausted. My brother was lazy. He did nothing but sleep, eat, and occasionally wander around. But he never seemed exhausted when he came home, and he didn't drink or smoke, so it wasn't from any vices. That strange smell from my brother still lingered. It was awful. I asked my parents if they could smell it too, but they just looked at me strangely and asked what I was talking about. I told them that my brother smelled like something dead. They laughed at me, saying they didn't smell anything unusual, only the scent of someone who hadn't showered, a typical out in the sun smell. About a week later, I heard my brother groaning early in the morning. I quickly went to his room and found him lying in bed, his eyes shut tight, as if he was having a nightmare. He was still asleep, so I tried to wake him. Suddenly, he jolted awake, gasping for air. He said he had a terrible dream. He saw the creature from the acacia tree near the path by the rice fields again. In his dream, it was pulling out his internal organs, and he saw his intestines being removed right in front of him. He frantically touched his stomach, checking for any wounds, then lifted his shirt. I was shocked to see scratch marks on his side. I asked him how he got them, but he just shook his head and said he had no idea. He insisted that they didn't hurt and brushed it off as mere stretch marks. Then he pulled down his shorts slightly, revealing a large bruise on his thigh, swollen and with deadened skin. The moment he did, a putrid stench hit me. It was overpowering. I leaned in to confirm. It was definitely coming from his leg. I cursed under my breath. What was happening to him? He was taken to the hospital again, but the doctors found nothing wrong with him. I didn't know why this was happening. At that time, my parents weren't coming home until the afternoon. Our house helper also saw my brother's condition and was shocked. He asked why my brother had a bruise. It looked as if he had been beaten up. Even my brother had no idea that he had a bruise on the back of his thigh. It wasn't noticeable unless you really examined it. I poked it, but my brother felt no pain. It was as if it was nothing to him. But believe it or not, the moment I pressed on it, something oozed out. It was a thick, reddish pus, and the foul smell intensified. My brother squeezed the wound, and it burst like a boil, releasing a large amount of pus. I could see the yellowish flesh inside, and there were even tiny worms wriggling within. Without hesitation, I rushed my brother to the hospital. He could still walk, but with every step, he grimaced in pain. That was the first time he actually felt something, meaning he had been completely numb to it before. The wound was worsening without him realizing it. At the hospital, the doctors simply cleaned the wound, applied antibacterial medication, and prescribed antibiotics. According to their examination, it was an infection, likely caused by a puncture wound from a needle or something contaminated with bacteria. I firmly told them that my brother never felt any pain before the wound burst. If it was truly an infection, wouldn't he have felt the swelling? The doctor couldn't give me a definite answer. He just smiled awkwardly, saying he had no idea. But they assured us my brother had no underlying illness, such as diabetes. They told us to just observe his condition and continue the antibiotics. So we went home. I could see that my brother was suffering. I too was struggling to find an explanation for what was happening. Imagine even the doctor had no answer. He just kept staring at my brother with a strange smile. That day, I ended up missing 2 of my classes, but I didn't mind. I couldn't just leave my brother alone in that state. When we got home, my brother finally spoke to me. He told me that maybe a supernatural being was doing this to him, the entity that lived near the acacia tree by the rice fields. I dismissed his claim, telling him not to believe in such things. It was all just a delusion. But he got angry with me. He said if I didn't want to believe, that was up to me. But the truth was, he used to pass by that path all the time. And there was one time when he was grabbed by a pitch-black figure. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. He had never believed in the supernatural before, but the encounters became more frequent. One day, he saw the entity up close, and he ran away because its face was terrifying. Still, he tried to convince himself it was a trick of his mind, but when he turned back to check, it was still there, staring at him. The figure kept changing its shape. He was certain it wasn't just a hallucination because he could hear its footsteps and the rustling sounds it made as it moved. That was when my brother started experiencing nightmares. He said they happened every night. Some were mild, but others were unbearable. And even now, the entity continued to appear in his dreams. Our house helper, Manang Aying, overheard my brother's story. Without hesitation, she said my brother had likely been cursed by an encanto, a nature spirit. She explained that his experiences were not normal, and his sickness wasn't ordinary either. She suggested taking my brother to an Albularyo, a traditional healer. But I immediately dismissed the idea, telling her to stop with such nonsense. These were just delusions. Only science could explain what was happening. The doctor told us to observe my brother's condition, and we needed to follow his advice. When our parents found out about everything, they agreed with the doctor's recommendation. But a week later, my brother's wound had worsened. The infection had spread to my brother's groin area. Even his private parts were oozing pus. At that time, it was Manang Aying who was taking care of cleaning him up. She repeatedly insisted that we should bring him to an Albularyo, traditional healer, but I refused to listen. By then, my brother could no longer stand or walk. His room smelled like a marketplace full of rotting goods. The stench was unbearable. The infection spread further, reaching his knees. His flesh had turned into a rotten squash-like texture, with a decayed yellowish color. We kept going back to the doctor, but they found no other illness apart from the infection. Stronger medications were prescribed, yet he still wasn't healing. In fact, he was getting worse. My father finally decided to take him to Dumaguete and admit him to a private hospital. There, they conducted a thorough examination, which took an entire week. We waited anxiously for the results. Then the diagnosis came: bone cancer. I was confused. How could it be bone cancer when the wounds were on his flesh? But we had no choice but to accept the doctor's explanation. We started to question things. Why had it taken them so long to figure it out? It was as if the doctors themselves struggled to identify what my brother's illness really was. Then one day, a nurse approached us. For some unknown reason, she slipped up and told us something alarming. The doctors actually had no idea what the sickness was. They just gave a diagnosis to have something to write down. At that moment, I knew I had been right all along. No one truly knew what was happening to my brother. Still, my brother underwent chemotherapy. His hair fell out. The wounds began to dry up slightly. But his private parts? They completely disintegrated. It was as if they had been erased, like chalk wiped off a blackboard. The infection continued to eat away at him, reaching his waist. Then the worst news came. The doctors gave him a few months to live. There was nothing more they could do. They advised us to take him home to avoid further hospital expenses. They said we could care for him at home, but the message was clear. There was no hope left. Our family was devastated. We were filled with anger, confusion, and helplessness, nearly driven to madness by the situation. Back at home, my brother's condition worsened. The stench became unbearable. No one could enter his room without wearing a mask. And yet, despite everything, he continued to survive. By this time, my brother's right leg was completely lifeless. The flesh had rotted away, revealing the bone. The wound had spread all the way to his ribs. I could even see his intestines through the open wounds on his right side. I wasn't entirely sure, but it looked like his internal organs were visible. His left leg was still alive, but completely paralyzed. He could still talk, eat, and even relieve himself, but his bodily functions had to be assisted. A tube had been inserted into his side to help him pass waste. It was at this point that we finally started believing this wasn't a normal illness. We had lost all hope. We were grasping at straws, willing to try anything. Desperate, my parents finally decided to call an Albulario. They sent Manyang Aying to find one. She returned with an old man, muscular, long-haired, but with a bald spot on the top of his head. The moment he stepped into the house, his expression darkened. He was furious, a mix of anger and shock on his face.
Why didn't you bring him to me earlier? Why did you wait until it got this bad?
He scolded us. The Albulario was livid. He accused us of only calling him when my brother was already on the verge of death. None of us could say a word. It felt like we had been slapped with the harsh truth. Despite his anger, the Albulario agreed to perform a ritual. He instructed us to prepare offerings because he would attempt to negotiate with the spirit that afflicted my brother. According to him, this wasn't just a curse. It was far worse than witchcraft or black magic. My brother had been struck by a rare form of bati, a supernatural affliction, one that, if left untreated, would cause his entire body to decay while he was still alive. The victim would witness their own body rot away, piece by piece. According to the Albulario, my brother would only die once the wound reached his heart. Until then, we had to do everything we could. He also instructed us to have someone pray in our house every day as a form of spiritual protection, a barrier against negative energy while we prepared for the offering ritual. Let's call this Albulario Mang Arturo. He was a well-known healer, the one Manang Aying sought out because of his proven abilities. He scolded us, saying,
Didn't he tell you that he saw a supernatural entity? You should have listened. Just because you're all professionals doesn't mean you can ignore something like this. If it were a medical illness, then maybe science could help. But this is spiritual. What can you do against it?
He then instructed us on what to prepare for the ritual. We had to dig a pit and slaughter 5 pigs. 2 of them had to be black. We also needed 10 chickens, 5 white and 5 pure black ones. Additionally, we had to gather various ripe sweet fruits. Among the chickens, one was to be a patani, a rare breed that is entirely black, including its feathers, skin, beak, and even tongue. We followed all of his instructions to the letter. After the preparations, our house looked like it was ready for a grand feast. There were so many people gathered, and the scene almost seemed festive. But deep inside, our family was filled with sadness and fear. During this time, Mang Arturo kept going back and forth to the Pilapil, the narrow farmland path. I followed him and saw what he was doing. He was kneeling in front of the massive acacia tree, his arms spread wide as he looked up toward the sky. Around him, there were various colored stones arranged in a circle, with fresh flowers placed in front of him. I watched as he muttered words, as if speaking to someone unseen. His expression was tense, anxious. When he finally finished, he shook his head in frustration, like a man who had just been rejected in courtship. I asked him what had happened. He said he tried speaking to the Lamang Lupa, earth spirit, but it refused to forgive my brother. The entity claimed that it had no ill intentions. It simply took a liking to my brother because he could see them. According to Mang Arturo, this meant that my brother had an open third eye and was spiritually sensitive, but due to his lack of understanding of supernatural beings, he had unknowingly disrespected them. The Lamang Lupa revealed that my brother had thrown stones at the acacia tree, unknowingly harming the spirits that lived there. Worse, he had killed one of them. At that moment, my mind was in turmoil. A part of me still refused to believe, but another part of me felt that maybe, just maybe, this was all real. Instead of panicking, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, a way to calm my own mind. I asked Mang Arturo what would happen next. He said we could proceed with the second option, the offering. I questioned why the offering had to be done in my brother's bedroom instead of by the acacia tree. After all, wasn't that where the entity resided? But the Albularyo's response unsettled me.
There are things that are difficult to explain, son. If you lack belief, you'll just think it's all nonsense. But here's the truth. Many supernatural beings are already inside your house. They are just waiting for your brother to take his last breath. The only one left outside is the one who cursed him. If the offering pleases them, they might collectively decide to lift the curse. The more spirits that side with us, the better. They think like humans in that regard.
I just nodded silently, still trying to process everything. Then, Mang Arturo made his final instruction.
At exactly midnight, I will begin the offering ritual. No one else must be inside the house except me and your brother. The process will last until dawn.
Mang Arturo admitted that what he was about to do was extremely difficult, as my brother was already at the edge of life and death. He had to find a way to intervene before it was too late. According to him, my brother was at the peak of his suffering, caught between darkness and light, and if nothing was done, he wouldn't survive much longer. At that moment, all the negative emotions flooded into our home, not just for our family, but even for the Albularyo. It was as if hope had completely disappeared. At exactly 11 p.m., everyone left the house, including our relatives and visitors. It almost felt like a family reunion, with people gathering outside, some even drinking to pass the time while waiting for midnight. We all stayed in a small kamalig, a hut near the house. My brother had built it as a secret retreat whenever he wanted to sleep outside, especially when it was too hot indoors. Some neighbors also gathered nearby out of curiosity, watching from a distance. Our relatives tried to shoo them away, but they wouldn't leave. The concern on our faces was obvious. Then, Mang Arturo arrived. He was carrying a large itak, machete, gripping it firmly as if preparing for battle. He wore a black bandana tied around his forehead, and his upper body was bare. Curiosity got the best of me. I wanted to see what was about to happen. I quietly found a spot behind the house, where there was a small gap in the window. Luckily, the window wasn't fully closed, allowing me to peek inside. From there, I saw my brother lying in his bed. The slaughtered pigs were laid out on the floor near the pit, their bodies untouched, with hair and all still intact. The same was true for the chickens. Fruits were scattered around, making my brother's room look more like a marketplace than a sick room. In one corner, there was a large bucket filled with the blood of the pigs and chickens. To my horror, Mang Arturo began pouring the blood over his body, drenching himself in it. I had no idea what purpose this served, but it made me sick to my stomach. The sight of it made me want to vomit. Afterward, he poured more blood into the pit. Then, to my shock, he jumped inside, disappearing from my view. Now, the only thing visible was my brother, lying in bed with candles placed around him. One large candle stood at the head of his bed, while several others were scattered throughout the room. The electricity had been turned off, leaving only the dim, flickering candlelight to illuminate the space. As I continued watching, I suddenly realized that I wasn't alone. To my side, my father was also peering into the room. He startled me by tapping my shoulder, making me jump and accidentally hit my head against the air conditioner unit. He asked me, "What do you see?" I can't see clearly from my position, I told him it was horrifying, disgusting. My father sighed and told me we should leave.
Didn't you hear Mang Arturo's warning? No one was supposed to stay inside except for him and your brother.
I argued that we were still technically outside, watching from a distance, so it should be fine. I also pointed out that maybe this rule was intentional. Perhaps we weren't meant to witness what would happen because it was too disturbing. Time passed slowly, and there was no sign of Mang Arturo. My father eventually grew impatient and walked away. Then I finally heard something. From inside the house, Mang Arturo's voice echoed. He was speaking loudly, angrily. It sounded as if he was fighting something. I couldn't understand anything I was hearing. Then suddenly, I heard what sounded like hacking, like someone chopping wood. But the sound wasn't coming from wood. It was the earth beneath the floor. I glanced at the clock in the living room, which was visible from my brother's bedroom. It was exactly 1 a.m. That was when I saw Mang Arturo climb out of the pit. I instinctively stepped back. He looked like a creature from the underworld. His entire body was covered in dirt and blood, and he was shaking as if he were freezing. He approached my brother and sat beside his bed. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Mang Arturo started crying. He wasn't just crying. He was sobbing, pleading, and begging as he glanced around frantically, as if speaking to multiple unseen entities. I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around me grew unnaturally cold, and yet there was no wind, no movement in the trees or grass outside, and yet I felt something invisible brushing against my skin, an icy presence that made me shudder. Then, a crushing pressure filled the air. I could feel it in my chest. It was like something heavy was pressing down on me, making it difficult to breathe. That was the first time I ever experienced something like that. I later learned that what I felt was the presence of supernatural beings. Moments later, Mang Arturo extinguished all the candles in the room. The entire place was swallowed in darkness. I could no longer see anything. That was when true fear gripped me. I was alone at the back of the house, with nothing but the suffocating darkness surrounding me. I had always been skeptical of the supernatural, always wanting tangible proof before believing in anything. That was why I had insisted on secretly watching the ritual. I wanted to witness it for myself. But now, I wasn't so sure if I wanted to see any more. Minutes passed. Then I began to hear voices, whispers. Some were raspy, some were irritatingly high-pitched. Others echoed like they were in a church. Some were laughing, some were crying. And then, a woman sobbing. And among those eerie voices, I heard my brother making sounds, but they weren't words. It was just guttural groaning, inhuman, terrifying. Then suddenly, Mang Arturo relit the candles. A small relief washed over me as the dim candlelight flickered back to life, breaking the darkness. But when I peeked back inside, I was horrified. I'm not a religious person, but at that moment, I instinctively made the sign of the cross, because what I saw wasn't human, it wasn't animal. I saw grotesque figures, horrifying, twisted beings staring down at my brother. And since my brother's bed was directly facing me, all those creatures were also staring straight in my direction. I saw something that looked like a tiyanak, a monstrous infant spirit. Another was a massive entity with only one hand, its skin resembling wet, rotting filth. But most of them were shadow-like figures, pitch black, yet strangely detailed. Their faces were grotesque, unnatural. I felt like my soul was leaving my body as I watched them. And yet, for some reason, I didn't run. It was like I was frozen, trapped between horror and fascination. A part of me was terrified beyond words, but another part of me wanted to keep looking. I told myself Why was I able to see them? My brother had only mentioned one entity, yet there were so many of them, crammed inside the room. But what was even more terrifying, despite the hole in the floor, none of them fell in. They were all floating. One by one, Mang Arturo began offering the sacrifices. I could see how much he was struggling. The pigs he had slaughtered were massive. As he performed the ritual, he called out to the creatures. Mang Arturo was incredible. He showed no fear despite being surrounded by those hideous entities. But no matter how much he pleaded, they ignored him. The Albulario became visibly distressed. That's when I started to lose hope. It seemed like the ritual wasn't working. I thought to myself, this is it. My brother is going to die. Tears welled up in my eyes. Then suddenly, the creatures vanished. Just like that. Mang Arturo's face was filled with confusion. Even I was shocked. Why did they suddenly disappear? Then, Mang Arturo started shouting. His voice was loud, desperate. He was begging. But I couldn't understand what he was saying. Was it another language? A few moments later, silence fell over the house. Mang Arturo stepped out of the room. I thought it was over. But it wasn't. He only left to drink some water before returning to the ritual. Then he grabbed a shovel and began filling the pit with dirt. I pitied him. He was doing it all by himself. The hole was massive, big enough to fit 2 coffins side by side. But he never once asked for help. After sealing the pit, he performed another ritual. He burned incense inside the house, filling the air with the scent of kamangyan, frankincense, which miraculously masked the unbearable stench. While doing this, he spoke to my brother, Damon. To my surprise, my brother was responding, and this time, he no longer struggled to speak, but he was crying. The ritual took a long time. Meanwhile, I was still crouching outside, my knees aching from pressing against the hard stones in the dirt. By dawn, the ritual was finally complete. I sat on the veranda, exhausted. My parents and relatives were still sleeping in the Kama League, waiting for Mang Arturo to finish. I waited for him to come out. When he finally did, he looked like a broken man. His face was drained, his body trembling from exhaustion, almost like he was drunk. He sat beside me. The smell of blood and sweat clung to him, unbearable. Then he spoke.
I succeeded. They've left your brother alone. In a few days, his wounds will dry up, and he will fully heal.
I was overjoyed, but my happiness was short-lived. Then, Mang Arturo added something that sent a chill down my spine.
The real question is, will your brother accept this? He survived, but his body is barely human anymore.
My heart sank. When my parents heard the news, they weren't relieved either. Instead, they looked disappointed, almost regretful. A month later, my brother Damon was completely healed. A few months after that, he underwent surgery to reconstruct his digestive system. They rerouted his intestines so he could pass waste normally again. But it came at a great cost. Yes, he survived. But in many ways, we felt like we had lost him. One of his legs was amputated. The other was permanently paralyzed. He was left in a wheelchair, more fragile than an old man on his deathbed. But the worst part, he cried every single day. Not a single day passed without him weeping. Seeing him like that broke us all. Every time we looked at him, we were reminded of the horror he had gone through. Then one day, he said something that shattered my heart.
My wounds are gone, but so is my purpose. I'm nothing now. I'm not even a man anymore.
And then, for reasons we still don't understand, he disappeared. It happened one afternoon. I had just arrived home. I went to his room, and he was gone. I asked our housekeeper where he was, but she had no idea where he had gone. I rushed outside searching for him, thinking that maybe he had just gone for some fresh air in his wheelchair. but he was nowhere to be found. I checked with our neighbors, asking if they had seen him pass by, but no one had. No one even noticed him leaving. My mind was in turmoil. I searched every corner of the house, hoping to find him, but he wasn't there. I called for help from Manang Aying, and soon, even her family joined in the search. Night fell, and my parents arrived home only to be met with the chaos of our desperate search for my brother. Then, someone came forward with chilling news. A body had been found near the mangrove area. They said it was a crippled man, holding a bottle of muriatic acid. We all ran toward the site, and there he was. My brother Damon was leaning against the massive acacia tree. I had assumed he would be found at the mangrove swamp, but no. He had gone back to the very acacia tree where it all began. I screamed his name. I cried and wailed until my voice was hoarse. My mother fainted on the spot. My brother had taken his own life. Maybe he couldn't bear the suffering anymore. Maybe in his mind, he was already dead, and keeping himself alive was just prolonging the pain. And because this place was where it all started, that's where he chose to end it. The pain was unbearable. As a family, we had made many mistakes. One of them was our arrogance, our refusal to believe in the supernatural. We thought we knew better. We dismissed what we couldn't explain. And the most painful part? My brother had told us. He had warned us, but we refused to listen. And by the time we believed him, it was already too late. All we did was make him suffer longer. Even now, I blame myself. The regret haunts me, again and again. I replay our mistakes in my mind. My mother never recovered from the grief. She carried the weight of my brother's horrific fate for years, until depression finally took her. And my father? He is now paralyzed. Depression consumed him too.